All right, a pretty happening first half in Buffalo to kick things off on Thursday night. And with that, week 8 in the NFL is just getting started. Here to look at the rest of the slate from a betting perspective, I'm honored to be rejoined by Ron Marmalefsky. Ron eats, sleeps, and breathes football betting. You will be able to find that abundantly clearly if you check out his bio or pin post on the platform formerly known as Twitter. We're going to call it X these days from time to time, at Ron Ace Sports. And Ron is also an avid fan of craft beer, so that makes him an ideal guest for this show. Ron, welcome back to Props and Hops.
I'm excited to be back with you, Matt. When I got the invitation, I said, great, get to hook up back with Matt, talk anything you want to talk in the world of football, in the world of beer. I'm good for it.
Sounds great. Well, I think we will cover some good bases on both of those fronts. And a quick note right off the top to those of you who are with us live on Twitter and YouTube, feel free to weigh in with any questions or comments, and we'll be happy to work that into the show when possible as well. Ron, we will get to some picks soon for week 8 in the NFL, but I know that the hops are at the forefront of your mind a good chunk of the time. And dark beer is usually the way that you go. So I'm curious for this conversation, what you're drinking this evening.
First time I'm getting this. This is a toddy porter. See if I can put it out there. From the Samuel Smith Old Brewery, Tadcaster. Take a drink. Pretty smooth. It's a keeper.
This is your first time having this beer?
Yep. Broke it out for the show. I go to Total Wine or some of those, and I just peruse the dark beers, and then I buy 3 or 4 of them, just singles, and see if I like them.
That's great way to make some fun new discoveries and keep things on your toes a little bit. I'm gonna note that I am working on a can that I will also try to get into frame. It's a beer called Party Cup. It is, let's say, if your brand is dark beer, mine is definitely the hops, and this is an American lager with mosaic hops, 5% ABV, so nice and crushable, out of North Park Beer Company in San Diego. I would say arguably the best brewery and the best craft beer city in the country. And this one is citrusy, tropical, got some notes of blueberry and some pine for a nice, good hoppy backbone. The straw pale color here, I've got it in a glass as well, so you can see the really light color. I guess is a nod to the name Party Cup. It looks like something that would be destined for a red Solo cup. And it totally can be, but I think a beer of this quality is definitely good enough to take any of those parties to the next level. So, Ron, on that note, cheers.
Cheers.
All right, and let's dive into some NFL talk as we work on the beers that we've got side by side tonight. This week, as we hit week 8, I know now with the longer regular season, it's no longer as official, but I feel like unofficially, still kind of a demarcation of the halfway point of the season. And Ron, as we hit that milestone, if you will, what would you say are your takeaways so far this season as a bettor?
There's a couple of ways to approach this, and one of which would be observations. We saw reckless play, people who definitely didn't use the exhibition season to their advantage. Usually week 1 is a throwaway week because what happens in week 1 isn't repeatable. Different teams are at different stages. This year, I thought it took at least 2 weeks, maybe some teams into 3 weeks before they got going. I think the 3-game exhibition is hurting development. And not that people were playing that much, but in 4, they can pace themselves even better. And then you have 2 weeks between the 3rd game and the season. And these guys haven't even gotten in close to 60 minutes of action. A lot of hamstring injuries and so on. I just think it just went a little bit further and before we saw some quality play. And then a notable thing that I saw as somebody who charts line of scrimmage data is that sacks were way up. Now you can easily notice it by every time Sam Howell drops back with Washington or Dan Jones drops back with the Giants. I mean, these teams are on otherworldly paces for allowing sacks. But sacks in the league as a whole, I believe it's been almost 30 years, the pace right now, as far as how many sacks per team per game. And it's something to take note of and something to build into the model because if there's more sacks, that means quarterbacks that aren't comfortable in the pocket are going to have a harder time reaching receivers. It's going to affect how they move the ball down the chains, what play calls are being out. Are they going to use safer plays? Are they going to go and do 3-yard outs instead of stretch the field because they're being bull rushed so much? So that's a takeaway for me. A personal takeaway, or a couple of personal takeaways for me in my own betting repertoire, is that I started slow this year. I was so gung-ho in 2022. I had so many rapid fire great situations, and I felt like, like a basketball shooter, they keep shooting, but they're missing the rim or whatever. I didn't really feel comfortable, and I was roughly 5 wins, 8 losses going into week 4. Complete turnaround from what was going on in college. So truth be told, I was kind of floundering. And then once we got to the 4th week, and especially the 5th week, I said, oh my goodness, I'm starting to see things. This is really clear. The start of the second quartile, my favorite week. And I unleashed one play in week 4. I don't know if that's unleashing when you have one play, but
Going big.
it was a big one, and it hit. It just happened to be Houston against Pittsburgh. It had all the model things that I wanted. And then I had 9 plays, including my 4 biggest plays of the season in week 5, the quartile week. That's so important to me. It's so important to coaches. And I thought that I was seeing it clearly, and I did. It was a very, very, very strong week. And that surprised me that week 6, which is historically not a great week for me for a variety of reasons, that I only had 1 play again in week 6, which I lost. And then last week, I knew that I had patience, but I really had patience to go from 1 to 9 to 1 to 7 plays. So really thought it was a good week. So I think knowing how each person, knowing yourself and knowing how you operate, the takeaway for me was, don't force things. If it's not there, don't do it. One other takeaway, if I can take a couple more minutes, is that I was a little bit more aggressive with in-season plays this year. Usually I would sit and percolate over it, and then the in-season play would be gone. But I think through the brainstorming with Chris, Las Vegas Chris, and through some other avenues, we sometimes live bet on the show. And we've been able to notice different things like, oh my goodness, the Jets, they don't have that hard of a schedule. Their defense is playing above expectations. Let's hit the season win total. Tennessee's and fire sales. Let's not wait on that. Alternative methods of betting games this week that we could get into a little bit later on. So my strategy changed a little bit. My methodology didn't change, but I'm more comfortable in making in-season plays than I have been in the past.
And I think that can be such a valuable part of the arsenal for a lot of bettors moving forward, because now it seems like big groups are quicker to pull the trigger on full game point spreads. And when those markets move, sometimes the derivative markets can be places where opportunity hangs on a little bit longer. So I think that's a good point, and it'd be great to circle back on that throughout the course of this conversation. One follow-up with you before we get to some sides that we're looking at on the NFL Week 8 card. You mentioned quartiles a couple of times, and I know on one hand, I teed you up by asking about Week 8 being an unofficial midway point of the season, so we can think of it as perhaps the end of the second quartile. And on the other hand, it seems like maybe a bit of an arbitrary way to chunk out the season. So I think for some bettors, it could be tough to grasp what's so significant about it. When you mentioned even with NFL coaches, this being really significant, or for yourself as a bettor, what's the value that you found in your own process of looking at things through the lens of certain quartiles of an NFL season?
Okay, yeah. Could be a long answer. I'll try to shorten it. But the move from the first quartile to the second quartile, even in a 17-game season, we heard 3 coaches specifically talk about game 4 being the end of the first quartile, even though it doesn't add up evenly like it used to, that week 5 is so important. The start of the second quartile is the most important week for any team that's 3-1 and any team that's 1-3. There are other qualifiers with that I won't, one of the last things I may not divulge in public, but there are certain reasons why 3-1 teams might let down a little, and 1-3 teams cannot afford to go 1-4, because if they go 1-4, history tells us you're almost dead. So it's such an important week. And there's 3 methods that I use to handicap. One of them is situational, but one of them is power rate ranking, and how, what's the right line? What's the true line? And the other one, of course, is matchup analysis. How does this offensive line match up with this defensive line? Can they protect versus the rush? Can they get through? Can they control line of scrimmage by running the ball? What's the pass defense look like? We don't have to get into all the various model formulas that Pro Football Focus gets into. Sometimes it's better just to simplify things. The game hasn't changed that much. It's really who wins the line of scrimmage that matters. But if you combine those 3 things, and one of it being the week 5 quartile, that's really important. After that, week 8 is very artificial, because let's say 6 teams come off their bye after 6. We had 6 teams that just came off their bye. In essence, what I say, Matt, is that their second quartile ended already. That after week 4, they had a 2-game second quartile. They had some goals that they had to hit before they got into their bye week. And that's, wherever their bye week placement is, that's going to be most likely the end of their second quartile, unless their bye week is week 12, 13. So the bye week is the quartile 1 ends the same for everybody. But after that, it's a mismatch of stuff. And it's really quartile 1 that matters the most.
All right, so I think I heard you refer to week 8 as a bit of a more arbitrary week, or I can't remember the exact wording, but it made me think this might be an interesting time to bring you on. So I'll have to file away a note to make sure to get you for week 5 in future seasons. But with the card in front of us, looking at the week 8 slate, Ron, is there a side that stands out to you as we record this on Thursday evening?
Yeah, if you were recorded this on Monday evening, it would have been better, because both in a Monday article that I wrote for Wager Talk and in our brainstorming session that we share with the world, Chris and I, not that we were in agreement, but I talked about all the reasons why San Francisco was vulnerable against Cincinnati. So it's a little bit unfair to bring that particular one up, because the line of 6 and 5.5 is gone, and now it's 3.5. Although I did some interesting things with that. I wanted to bring this particular thing up. If you think Cincinnati is going to steal a win in this game, which is more likely now than it was before, considering Burrow is rested, and we had a philosophical discussion as to how we should weight the first 4 games, with Burrow being, 25% of himself, and me thinking that he's now 90% of himself right now. Then I would pivot to the season win total. If going over 8.5 wins, which last I checked didn't change due to this news, because everything was focusing on San Francisco's problems with Purdy. And it's not necessarily that Purdy to Darnold is a downgrade. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, by a point or 2 or whatever, depending on how you value turnovers, because Darnold would be more likely to throw turnovers. But that would have been my call in terms of Cincy. If I had to give you one now in a very complicated week for me, because I don't like as many dogs, and I know myself, and I'm more of a dog, whenever I can, I would play underdogs. Houston would be my play right now in terms of where they are at +3 or greater. As far as matching, not power rating wise, I think the line of 3 is accurate. But my matchup analysis favors Carolina slightly, and then situational analysis also favors Carolina slightly in terms of that 0-6 team, winless teams off a bye. I would never use that as a standalone reason to play a game. You have to have something connected to it. But I think 3 points is reasonable to assume that it could be a 3-point game either way.
Got it. So I think I first heard you say Houston, but then if you talk about taking the points, it sounds like are we instead thinking Carolina?
I'm sorry,
I
I made
hosting Houston.
Carolina +3. Thanks for correcting me there.
Okay, for sure. And I'm glad, because at first I thought this might get real interesting real quick, because the one side that I have bet thus far this week is Carolina +3. And usually I try to pay attention to the people I trust, and just reading the market, getting in at the right time. I liked it at a flat +3, and now you can get Carolina +3 at even money. So that gives me a bit of trepidation knowing that there's clearly somebody with some market influence who is in on Houston here. But when I look at the Panthers, yeah, +3 at even money right now, I thought that I could safely say I liked it up to -115. So maybe we've got some wiggle room here, but I know that of the people I tend to trust when I really try to curate my picks here, Adam Chernoff on the simple handicap, Rob Pizzola on forward progress, Steve Fezzik with Las Vegas Chris on the Bet US NFL show, as well as some other company on the Dream Preview. A lot of love for Carolina, and I think one of the factors is their offensive coordinator, Thomas Brown, taking over play calling duties coming off the bye. And it sounds like Brown is going to be a lot more modern and creative with the offense than what we saw through the Panthers' first 6 games. We can look for more pre-snap motion, probably getting some wide receivers open, even though I don't want to bank on too much space for that wide receiving core. I do think that offensively, there is a lot of upside for Carolina that we just didn't see the first 6 weeks of the season. And we'll see what Bryce Young can do in perhaps, again, a more modern scheme. On the other side of the ball, I think that it was Rob Pizzola who brought up a good point to me. This could be a nice step down in class for the Panthers defense. Their last 4 weeks, Miami, Detroit, Minnesota, Seattle, all good offenses. And I don't get into the X's and O's too much, but I heard that Carolina is predominantly a cover 3 defense. And that's the one look that has given CJ Stroud some trouble in an otherwise excellent start to his career under center for Houston. So between the defensive scheme, a step down in class there, a change in play caller on the other side of the ball, Carolina coming off the bye, this seems like it has the feel, as much as I try not to handicap on feel, it seems like it could be a bit of a midseason reset. Any thought on that angle in addition to what you had already outlined for Carolina this week?
Well, first of all, it's nice to be in good company where we're all thinking alike. And then we still stand at best a 60% chance of winning the play because it's football. The ball's round. It has funny bounces. There's guys with stripes on their uniforms doing this. Somebody could drop a ball. So nothing's a lock, even if good minds are all on the same side. Houston's a one-dimensional offense in my mind. They haven't gotten the running game going. That makes it easier for a defense. There's no advantage in terms of the bye week. There's an advantage for both teams, so there's no advantage in a way, because I've always said that new coaches need early bye weeks to reset because the season goes so fast for these guys. It doesn't matter if they've coached before. They've never coached this team before. So I'm glad that both coaches have that. And Carolina change in play caller, if that makes them a little bit more unpredictable, I'm all for it because they've been a little bit predictable in nursing their quarterback along, Bryce Young. If they could open up the playbook a little bit more, capitalize on Houston allowing 7 out of 10 completions, then maybe we have a chance here in terms of seeing some things that are open that maybe weren't open in the past because it'll be harder for Houston to scheme against Carolina.
Yeah, and part of the scheme that we'll be looking at, Dan Rivera in the chat noting, Panthers' weakness on defense is stopping the run. Are the Texans capable of taking advantage? They have been pretty weak for the year. I'm not familiar with, again, the ins and outs of the Panthers front 7 versus what the Texans can do on the ground. But I think so much upside for Houston that we've seen is driven by CJ Stroud. So maybe that has me less concerned about the Texans doing damage on the ground at Carolina. Although, Ron, you're probably closer to this than I am. So any thoughts on the point that Dan brings up in the chat there?
I think they're going to try to establish the run with Pierce for some reason. And I don't know, it's just the new coaching staff, the fact that they were missing a couple of offensive linemen, the fact that the scheme has changed. Pierce, who had a pretty good rookie year, has run for a lot closer to 3 yards per carry than 4 yards per carry this year. But the danger is that they will be able to establish the run. Offhand, they haven't quite been able to do that. So I'm banking on the stats holding up and that Carolina resetting on the defensive line with the bye week. But it is a slight concern on my part.
All right. Well, one more thing I'll throw your way here. Another comment we got in the chat from Wes noting that he has some interest in thoughts on situational spots, such as fading a team off a huge win, taking a team off a bad loss, taking a team with big revenge against the team that beat them last time. Generally, over time, I have become more and more dismissive of situations like this, not because they don't matter, but because, to my knowledge, to the extent that they do matter, they're already baked into the line. So I don't think there's some hidden edge we can get by handicapping too predominantly based on factors such as this. But Ron, you did mention that one of the factors that you use to handicap is situationally. So what do you think of some of the topics that Wes has outlined here?
Well, there's a couple ways to go on it. When a team gets humiliated, they lose 44-6 or something, they tend to bounce back. They know they got humiliated, so they tend to bounce back. If a team appears on a Monday after some of these situations, a standalone game, it tends to help a little. The best example I could give of situational betting was the Miami Buffalo game, which was at that time Buffalo was 3-1 playing Miami, and Buffalo needed that game. They didn't want to fall 2 games back, Miami. And Buffalo Miami games over the course of the years have been very important and critical. And Buffalo did their job. They won that game. They're proud of themselves. And then they head over the pond and then they go to London. They go to London without Milano, he got hurt at some point, maybe in the game. They go to London without Tre'Davious White. They go to London after playing Miami, and they're about 15-50 after against the spread after playing Miami. They go to London to play Jacksonville, who's already been there a week. They go to London to play Jacksonville, who gets their left tackle Cam Robinson back after a 4-game suspension. I mean, you're adding up factor after factor after factor. That's the best situational spot I can give you as an example.
All right, I'm glad we have you on board because I had a pretty general answer that has served me well for the most part. But clearly, when you've got specifics, I think the key there is it's not just any one factor in particular, but when you can layer one on top of another on top of another, then that's where we might start to break through the noise and get into some signal.
Right.
All right. Well, we will move on here. And Dan, I saw your chat as well about the Chargers. We'll get into them. I'll flash this in a bit because if you know where they are in terms of their point spread range, if we're going to talk teasers, they're one of the teams that fits the model. Ron, we've got looking at crossing through that corridor of 3 and 7 at -120 or better, which you can no longer find in Vegas, I guess, but other places. If you shop around a bit, odds are you'll be able to get that good price on advantage teasers. 6 fits that I'm seeing on the week 8 board right now. Pittsburgh up to +8.5 hosting Jacksonville. The Giants up to +8.5 hosting, in air quotes, the Jets. And then Tennessee up to +8.5 at Atlanta. Green Bay up to +7.5 hosting Minnesota. My Chargers down to -2.5 hosting Chicago on Sunday night. And Detroit down to -2 hosting the Raiders on Monday night. Ron, a lot of options to choose from on this week's card. I'm wondering if we're to look at that standard 2-team 6-point teaser, what would your selection be right now?
Let's see. Curling? Could we go to a curling game instead? I don't know. I'm probably the last person that you would want to ask about teasers because I'm kind of anti-teaser, probably because I remember the days when there were lower scoring games, lower variance, and teases, 6-point teases everywhere were even money. So why do I want to lay -120, -130 when totals are 3.5 points higher than they used to be? But to answer your question, the only one that would make sense to me this week is I would argue that there would be a less than 10% chance that the Lions lose this week against Vegas. The Lions are too defensively sound to not stop Josh Jacobs and force whoever is at quarterback for Vegas to be one-dimensional. We know Vegas's defense, they allow 7 out of every 10 passes to be completed. Jared Goff is an accurate passer. It's a bounce back situation for a Detroit team that we just talked about off a huge loss playing in a standalone Monday night game. I would be very surprised if Detroit lost this game. Therefore, that would be the tease. If I had to throw another tease in there for the fun of it, and I would only tease games I would bet normally. But and my over-under for number of teases going into week 18, because I sometimes tease the last week of the season because the last week of the season is a very weird week. And you have to get an early, late, first quarter, second quarter, and so on. So throwing that out, my over-under and number of teases for the year would probably be 3.5. So we're not going to have a lot of teases. But I would say probably I would pick Green Bay going over the 7. If they're still a dog at 1, then you do a 6.5-point teaser to get them to 7.5.
Yeah, and right now there are 1.5s out there, so even the standard 6-point teaser would get you through
Okay.
the key number of 7. Ron, I definitely raised an eyebrow when you said that week 18 is the one week you tend to play more teasers. That is typically the stay away week because it can be such a volatile week and teasers are inherently a bet against variance. So please elaborate on where you might play 3 or fewer teasers the first 17 weeks of the season, but actually look to ratchet things up in that regard come week 18 when the rest of the market seems to be staying away.
Yeah, a red flag there, huh? Well, ratcheting it up might be 2 or 3. It's because if you could get a number, and I can get this all the time, if you can get a number right away that you know is wrong because teams are going to sit because of playoff situations and
Mm-hmm.
so on. Let's say you're getting a number that you're plus 2.5 or something like that, and you know they're going to be the favorite at 3, by 3 or 4 by the time people realize that somebody's going to play half the game or this or that. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not just that I'm betting the tees. Of course, I'm betting the game at even at plus 2.5 for money line. But if I have a chance to move it up to 8.5 or 9 or something like that, I'm essentially getting not 6 or 7 points of value. I'm getting 10 points of value according to what I think is going to happen. And I'm going to pair that with
Mm-hmm.
third quarter and fourth quarter lines. So I'm just finding alternative ways to get numbers that are so far off what I think the number is going to be based on week 18 shenanigans that go on.
Got it. So it's primarily driven by having an information edge when you're confident that you can pay for 6 points, but maybe get 10 or more.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Okay. And then one more follow up, and I'll get to a teaser that I can give a stronger endorsement to for the week 8 card. Um, I hear you that back in the day, there was a lower scoring environment, although we seem to be trending in that direction after games were frequently in the 50s not so long ago. But thinking about, decades ago, lower scoring environment, teasers were widely thought of as sucker bets, often offered at even money. I get where having to lay a higher price in a higher scoring environment isn't as appealing. But one thing I've been wrestling with and trying to navigate as far as my own process goes when it comes to betting is on one hand, always wanting to get the best of the number, and on the other hand, trying to come to terms with the fact that if you've missed the best of the number, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've missed a bettable number. So I would say that yes, maybe the edges used to be bigger, but if minus 120 still gives you an edge, then why not play it, even if that edge is less than it would be if the price being offered were even money? Does that kind of concept check out the way I lay it out there?
Matt, this is fun. I remember the last time we talked, we had a good quarterback discussion. So now we're having a good tease discussion. So this is good. For the educated better, for the guys who layer teases and do it as hedges and do it like Chris does it, probably a little bit like you do it and so on. Not as valuable what I'm going to say next, but for the uneducated bettors, if somebody comes up to me and says, yeah, if I can take a tease from 2.5 and move it up to 8.5, I think I have a 70% chance of winning that game. The problem is you've got to pair it with another game. And if you have two 70% opportunities and you multiply it, technically you have a 50-50 proposition and you're laying 120 or more, you're going to lose money over the long run. So my advice is if you're doing teases for the sake of teases, that you're just trying to get numbers and you're not really invested in that game anyway, isn't that a crutch to try to have two games? I'm more of the one game at a time. If you like the game, you like the game. And yeah, sometimes that 6 points is going to mean something. But if you really think that you need the 6 points, maybe you like the other side because you're worried about the other side. I just think you have to handicap. You have to know yourself. You've got to handicap the games. I understand what you said about losing a line. Especially if you lose a point of the line, maybe you could have got 3.5 and now you're getting 2.5. Well, you don't want to really bet it at plus 2.5 when you could have had 3.5. That's certainly not something you're going to do, but you really want the game. I'll give you something that I did this week, for example, but I did it for other reasons. I parlayed a couple of things by manipulating the lines. Tennessee was in fire sale, and they traded their best cornerback. Who knows what else they're going to do between now and the trade deadline? I'm not a big fan of Atlanta, but I'm thinking the body language of Atlanta is going to be good. Why don't I take them at even with the money line and put them with Cincinnati, who was 5.5 minus 105 at the time, and move the Cincinnati line up to +7. I already bet it at 5.5. I already bet it at 6. Why don't I move it at an even 7 and parlay Cincinnati +7 to even? That's not a teaser, but it's manipulating points. It's a
Mhm.
strange way of responding to your point, but I got plus, I think I wrote it down, plus 184 was the ticket. So in
Okay.
that case, I'm not laying 130. I'm not getting 6 points, but I'm not laying 130. So I don't have to be right 77% of the time like you do on the two-team teaser in terms of having both sides individually be right that way. But 50, what is it, 54 or something percent of the time to be right at minus 120. So at plus 184, I have much more leverage.
Got it. Okay, so not to get too far into the weeds here, because yeah, the way you just outlined it, if I'm doing basic addition and subtraction with my teaser approach, you're talking some calculus here, and minus 120 has a break even probability of 54.5%.
Okay.
Just doing a quick calculation there. But I think one point to clarify on my end is minus 120 is the max that I would recommend laying on a two-team 6-point teaser. So even if you're crossing 3 and 7, if you're getting charged minus 125 or minus 130, no thank you. So that in turn lowers the rate at what you must hit. I think you throw out needing to hit 77% of your teaser legs to make that a plus EV proposition. In the minus 120 range, I think you're more in the low 70s. And if I
Okay.
think I've got something that has about a 75% probability, especially now when we're seeing totals commonly in the 30s once again, then for me, it served me well. I think that there are maybe more optimal ways to do things if you really know what you're doing. But as a kind of crude rule of thumb for a lot of aspirational sharp bettors who maybe don't have the knowledge or experience or ability to do this for a living, I'll say that this week, if I'm looking at the teaser card, the two games that stand out to me, the one I like the most, you touch on it, Detroit -2 hosting the Raiders. And then I'm going to go outside the box and touch on a game that we haven't discussed yet and say I'll pair the Lions with the Chiefs, bringing them down to -1 at Denver. And it might sound counterintuitive because I just talked about crossing through the 3 and the 7. And if I'm teasing down to -1 on a 6-point teaser, that means I'm not going through the 7. I'm starting at 7 for Kansas City. However, the Chiefs are shaded towards 7.5. So I think knowing that teasers neutralize the VIG on a point spread, this is closer to getting 6.5 points for the price of 6. And I will throw out a word of caution. Road favorites do call for some more deliberate thought when we're looking at teasers. And there's a long track record of this, but just recent examples, the Bills at the Patriots last week, San Francisco at Cleveland the week before. So I am getting involved on the Lions and Chiefs teaser for a standard unit, but it's not something that I'll be unloading on just because I expect both teams to win and what could possibly go wrong. Crazier things have happened before. But similar to last week's moneyline parlay I had on this show that Las Vegas Chris turned me on to, the Chiefs with the Niners on a moneyline parlay. Unfortunately, San Francisco did not hold up its end of the bargain on Monday night. But I thought the Chiefs profiled so well with that type of bet and the profile well here because they don't always blow teams out like we might expect them to, but they almost always find a way to win. So getting them down to -1 when I will not be surprised at all if this game closes 7.5, I will take that. And with the Lions, they were exposed last week. And I think we saw some holes in their roster and their overall approach when it comes to trying to step up in class. But they're a pretty good bully when it comes to inferior opposition. And the Raiders certainly fit the mold as far as that's concerned. So with the Lions, I like the look at taking the vastly superior team at home, needing to do little more than win outright. And Ron, right before we came on, I looked a moneyline parlay with Kansas City and Detroit right now. The going rate's about -175. So in a teaser, you can save 55 cents on the VIG. Yes, there's a chance that one of these teams wins by 1 or 2 points, in which case the money line parlay cashes and the teaser doesn't. But to save 55 cents, I think it's well worth the risk and just play around with the key numbers a little bit. Any thoughts, not just on what you said earlier with the Lions, we're clearly seeing eye to eye there, but the Chiefs is a potential look in teasers this week as well.
First of all, I don't pretend at all to be the teaser expert. So there are ways to do things that I like listening to what Steve Fezzik says with the math because I'm a math guy. Every bet I make, I try to figure out return on investment. What's the odds that this person gets over 3.5 catches? What's the odds of this happen and this happen? So I think he's the guy to turn to for that. If you have some rationale, a good rationale for taking it. If I were a teaser player, I would probably find things with the Lions, even look ahead lines with the Lions. There's teaser opportunities actually next week that you could pair with the Lions that are probably better than this week. One concern I would have with Kansas City is Nick Bolton is out. And his speed and his ability to chase down guys and to cover sideline to sideline, he's probably worth a point because he can make Russell Wilson look silly. And Russell Wilson can look silly on his own sometimes right now, but Nick Bolton can make sure of that, because if Russell Wilson thinks he's going out of the pocket and he loses that clock time management, which he's been doing because he's so sack prone, Nick Bolton would be in his face. Well, Nick Bolton's not there now. That would be the one concern I would have.
All right, very fair. I think that Detroit was the easy leg to identify. Kansas City, I still feel good about. I would obviously prefer them to be at full strength. I would also think that Nick Bolton's absence is probably being built into the line fairly efficiently at this point. But it's also a matter of, to your point, it takes two to tango. So if we can identify the Lions right off the bat, where do we go for a second leg? A lot of my process of elimination is looking at who to cross off rather than who to cram into a bet. And we have a comment in the chat noting that rumor is Henry will be gone. Not sure if that's the case for Tennessee, but if it is indeed the case, then that certainly would keep me off teasing the Titans. Also, that line is shaded toward the 3, and we've got all kinds of variance when it comes to what Tennessee is going to get at quarterback in that game. So I can safely cross off the Titans based on my typical approach. When we look at Pittsburgh fitting the model, yes, but Jacksonville is shaded toward being a 3-point favorite, and I prefer a cleaner cross through the 3. And I know the Steelers are doing something right that doesn't show up in the box score because they're just winning too many of these games that it seems like they have no business winning. But I think there are so many metrics telling us that there's some unsustainable luck probably in play. I'm willing to admit that I might have a blind spot with something that Tomlin and this team are doing way better than I know to give them credit for. But I'm also seeing enough to say that, all right, maybe they don't suck, but I also think that they're not as good as their record today would indicate. So if I can cross off Pittsburgh and Tennessee, also the Giants, that game is shaded toward the Jets as a 3-point favorite, and it's at 3 at even money at Circa right now. So those are teams that I'm pretty comfortable crossing off. Green Bay was a tough one for me to rule out. I don't know that I can make much of a case against them in teasers this week, except for maybe some variances. Jordan Love continues to try to find his footing in this league. And then with the Chargers, I mean, they're also tough to make a case against on the teaser card for me this week, except for the fact that anytime anybody wants to back the Chargers to win by any sort of a margin, even just a field goal, it feels like we could be playing with fire. And Ron, on that note, we did have a comment earlier from Dan asking about the Chargers. Palmer now showing up on the injury report. Do they get their rookie first-round draft pick, Quentin Johnson, more involved, or is he just too raw? I'm glad to have you on when we get this question because we previewed the draft together and you dive into the draft like nobody else. All I've noticed as a Chargers fan is that Quentin Johnson has been alarmingly absent from this offense, especially since Mike Williams tore his ACL at Minnesota a few weeks ago. What have you been seeing? And is there any chance that he can step up and fulfill some of the promise of his first-round draft pick pedigree?
Yes, in 3 years. How's that for a terrible answer?
All right, so
he
maybe
came
he
into
is
the
just
league.
too raw.
He came in the league being able to run one route, and that was it. So he was going to be raw. Why didn't they draft Jordan Addison? I know they prefer a certain type of receiver. We've seen that in the past. We saw it with Palmer in some way because I had somebody else that they could have taken in that draft. They could have drafted Zay Flowers, which would have been an enormously great addition and a different kind of wide receiver, but they didn't. They drafted Johnson, who was held to one catch for 3 yards in the title game, TCU against Georgia. Johnston, who basically didn't run fast enough that he's going to separate, and he doesn't have, at this point in time, Mike Williams' contested catch ability. Almost no one has Mike Williams' contested catch ability. I mean, that's just a trait that he has. There was another guy from Texas Tech that had that trait years and years ago. I'm blanking on the name, but he played a long time in the league and he was really good at that. Mike Williams has that, and Johnson doesn't. And he had a case of the drops all preseason as well, and that didn't inspire confidence. So he's not going to fulfill the role. He's too much like Keenan Allen, but not anywhere near the ability at this point of Keenan Allen. So they're going to have to get Eckler on the flats. They're going to have to do a lot of interesting things. My issue with the Chargers isn't so much offensively. It's that there's too many gaps in the pass defense with their linebackers. Their linebackers are kind of slow to cover. And any lead in a Charger game, one way or another, is dangerously in peril at the end of a game.
So it sounds like it might be a bit of a waiting game for Johnson to break through and fulfill some of that promise that we might have been hoping to see, those of us few Chargers fans out there, as soon as this season. And I'd say, as we wrap up this teaser segment, I love all the back and forth here. Ron, I like when our viewpoints are a little bit different and we can really dig into it, and we're getting some good questions and comments in real time from the audience as well. I would say that, again, as a reminder, I am confident making my teaser of the NFL Week 8 card. Detroit -2 hosting the Raiders, paired with Kansas City -1 at Denver. And then, because I also don't hate those Green Bay and Chargers legs, I think it could warrant a bit of a sprinkle on a 4-team teaser at +250 or better. A lot of books, again, outside of Nevada, a lot of books, if you shop around, will be offering that kind of payout. So consider Kansas City -1 at Denver, Detroit -2 hosting the Raiders, plus Green Bay +7.5 hosting Minnesota, and the Chargers -2.5 hosting Chicago as a possibly more lucrative payout, +250 on a 4-team teaser on this NFL Week 8 slate. Ron, with that, I think we've exhausted our teaser talk. So let's talk some props. I know that you have a lot going, even in the Thursday night game that's nearing the end of the third quarter right now. How about games later on in the week, either Sunday or Monday night? Any props that stand out to you on this week's slate?
Well, we don't have a lot of props right now that are up there. I'm looking. I put one up there. It's not a Sunday or Monday. It's actually the Atlanta game. It's the Tennessee Atlanta game, and I know people like overs, so I throw everybody a bone on overs. Most of them, I would say, I strive for 70% under props because it's contrarian and you get better value. I don't always reach 70% because I look at numbers and I think they're a certain way. And Drake London, I went over 48.5 in terms of his pass receiving yards. I'm seeing it tick up to about 50.5, but I have him in the 60 to 62 range. So I think there's still some wiggle room there. The reason I like Drake London is, first of all, he's their number one target for Atlanta. But most importantly, Tennessee is one of the 2 or 3 best teams at stopping the run. So they force opposing teams to pass more than they want to, which is a good thing against Tennessee because they don't do as good a job stopping the pass. So if I think that Ritter is going to have to pass more, and if I think that they're going to be looking for their number one target like Drake London, and if I think that Tennessee will allow at least 2 out of every 3 completions to be there, I think we'll see 5 out of 7 targets for Drake London. And if he can get 10 yards per catch, then we're over the 48.5 and we should be able to clear the 50.5. So that's my prop for you in this show.
All right. I like the breakdown, and I am seeing a couple of 50.5s still out there, 149.5, but it's pretty heavily juiced. Even at some sharper books that will take more of a bet when it comes to props, I'm seeing 52.5 is the consensus number. And some of these sharper books are juiced pretty heavily to the over at 52.5. So Ron, I know you mentioned that you could see London getting into the 60s. What would you say is a price ceiling when somebody is catching this conversation and giving London a look for his receiving yardage output?
What's the ceiling? I would say 55.5. I like to have a gap of a certain number of yards in there because, things could change. An injury, especially on overs, I like to have a gap. Sometimes I don't use as much of a gap for unders, but for overs, I like more of a gap because there's too many things I think that could go wrong with overs as opposed to unders. But I would say at the 48.5, at the 50.5 or whatever, I would say there's a 3 out of 4 chance that he goes over that number. So that return on investment at minus 115, minus 117, whatever. These books have strange numbers now for juice. So I thought it cleared the hurdle wide enough that I would make an early play on it.
Well, anything, if you think this is a 75% true probability, then we're saying that there's value. I mean, this sounds extreme to me, but that would equate to anything less than minus 300 would be plus if you're looking at it that way. So, of course, we wouldn't endorse that much juice on a prop like this. And books aren't going to charge that much. They would just move the yardage. But I think it's a sign of the confidence in a number like 52.5, even though this is moved up. If 52.5 is the consensus, still there are a few yards of wiggle room before we have to really think about cutting it off. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, 52.5. Let's cut it down to 65%. Even then, you have some wiggle room at 65%. I would say, 13 out of 20 times you're going to win that. So if you make $100 bet, you're winning 130. If you're wrong 7 times and you're laying 125 or something like that, you're still not getting close to the 1,300.
All right. Well, I will balance things out. I know you mentioned off the top you typically look toward unders. So there's one that I'm looking at. This will be more proactive. It's pending availability. So, Ron, I'll share my handicap, and I also want to get your thoughts on the market for a prop like this. I want to look at Jalen Hurts' rushing yards, and I know that it's not listed yet with a lot of concern about his knee injury, but I've done some research on this. Recently, Hurts has been lined in the low to mid 40s for his rushing yardage. And if and when a number for Hurts rushing yards gets posted for week 8, I think the under is going to get pounded. I'm not the only person in the world by any stretch with this thought, but I think if he's been lined in the low to mid 40s in recent weeks, if we can get anything in the mid 30s, let's say good to 35.5 to the under, I would still like that look. I think the Eagles are going to be calling fewer designed runs. And again, this Hurts injury is known. There's not a hidden edge here in that sense. But I have seen over time that books tend to anchor to previous lines and players' season averages. So it can be a struggle when setting the odds to fully account for an injury like this, especially when Hurts has been a little bit cryptic as to just how much of a limitation it might be. One subtle edge, if the injury is obvious, one subtle edge when it comes to quarterback rushing props to the under. I like it when I can get a team that's a pretty strong favorite, and the Eagles are favored by a touchdown right now at Washington. Quarterback kneel downs do count against a quarterback's rushing yardage output. So if Hurts is on the edge and the Eagles are just killing the clock at the end of the game, maybe this doesn't come into play or make a big difference, but there's a non-zero chance that that is a material difference when it comes to whether this wins or loses. So Ron, all things considered, thoughts on the handicap for Jalen Hurts under? If we're just guessing, maybe we see something in the range of 35.5. And do you think there's any realistic probability that we can get at that number anytime between now and kickoff on Sunday?
I think it's pretty realistic. I think the set will be right about what you're saying, 35.5. Maybe it'll shade a little lower. What I like about it is something else that you didn't mention. These teams played about 2 or 3, 4 weeks ago. So there's familiarity this year with Jalen Hurts. He ran 9 times for 34 yards in that game. So theoretically, when he was quote unquote healthier, Washington was able to stop them in a very high scoring game. Wasn't that something like 35-31? It was a pretty high scoring game. So obviously there were some yardage in that game to get to 66 points. And yet Hurts only ran for 34 yards. So I would add in the familiarity with the opponent probably helps in terms of, well, they know what Hurts's at least first game tendency was.
I like that confidence boost. And that game went into overtime. The Eagles won it with a field goal to clinch a win after Washington famously didn't go for 2 at the end of regulation. So even with an extra possession in overtime, Philadelphia still couldn't get too much rushing output out of Hurts. So, we'll keep our eyes peeled, and I'll look for Hurts. Let's call it under 35.5 if and when we see that number offered. Ron, soon I'll get into a rapid-fire rundown of our picks for this week's card. Before I get there, I would like to remind everybody that I am partnering with Right Angle Sports this season in an affiliate capacity. And a big part of my approach for doing so is that betting is fun, but winning can be really tough. And I think that part of the value I try to bring to the show is highlighting the best information from the sharpest sources. And with its team of pro sports bettors, Right Angle Sports has built a reputation as the gold standard for picks. They've got something for everybody, whether you're just getting into this or really want to get deep in terms of their offerings with the NFL, also their college basketball flagship service. So no obligation whatsoever. But if you're interested in trying their pick service, you can support Props and Hops by supporting Right Angle Sports. I built a custom link, tinyurl.com/RAS picks. And if you're with us on YouTube or in podcast form, that link is in the show notes. If you're with us on Twitter, that link is also in the bio. Ron, moving on to wrap up what we can consider the Props and Hops Week 8 portfolio. As far as sides go, a bit of a tepid endorsement for you on Carolina plus the 3 at even money. A little more conviction with me, knowing I've been ice cold on sides and much warmer when it comes to teasers and props. Take it for what you will, but Carolina plus 3, a look for both of us, currently available at even money. And I couldn't fault anybody for looking the Panthers' way, all the way up to plus 3 at minus 115. As far as teasers go, another lukewarm endorsement from Ron, but if we forced him to play a teaser this week, it would be Detroit down to -2 hosting Las Vegas, paired with Green Bay up to +7.5 hosting Minnesota. And I've got a lot of the same conviction on the Lions this week. I like pairing them with Kansas City down to -1 at Denver, and also sprinkling in a 4-team teaser, assuming you can get +250 or better, which is available if you shop around at some non-Nevada books. Kansas City and Detroit, the first 2 teams in that 4-team teaser, as well as Green Bay and the Chargers down to -2.5 hosting Chicago. As far as props go, not a tepid endorsement from Ron, but a pretty firmly stated play. Drake London receiving yards over, let's call it 52.5 is a consensus number with some wiggle room. Consider this playable up to 55.5. And then on my end, pending availability, but we do expect to see it in the coming days, Jalen Hurts rushing yards under, consider that good down to 35.5. Now, Ron, I know we're already more than 50 minutes in, a lot of good back and forth as we've been going through our picks for this Week 8 slate, but I can't let you go without weaving in a couple pillars of the show and also talking some process in addition to all the picks we just focused on. And I'm going to start with a process-driven question when it comes to bankroll management. And for context, as I alluded to a moment ago, my sides this year have just been brutal. The ROI is in the toilet. On this show, I'll be transparent. I'm 0-6 after winning in week 1 with the Dolphins at the Chargers. And in some cases, I feel like I deserved a better fate. That Mac Jones safety at Las Vegas was really painful to watch unfold in real time, like a slow motion car accident. And then some bets just didn't even deserve a chance. I mean, I was on the Lions last week at Baltimore. So at least that was a quick answer and a no sweat loser, if nothing else. When it comes to teasers and props, it feels like things are running unsustainably hot right now. Got to give a hat tip to friend of the show, Ed Fang. And I think his members at the Power Rank have been cleaning up on quarterback interception props with the work that Ed's been doing so far this season. So that said, when things are running really poorly, like with sides, or really well with things like teasers and props, I think it's important to accept that there's going to be some regression, both positive and negative, and things will probably move toward the middle. But at the same time, it's important to play to your strengths. So with that preamble, Ron, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you go about determining your bet sizing for different bet types.
Okay, yeah, it's different for a lot of reasons, and it really varies. For starting at the small end, the over-unders, the totals, and I've done decently with them, but I'm not an expert on them. I just look for different matchup analysis that lead me that way, or some week 1 and week 18 situations, again, that work. But I would have a bet size of 1/2, 1.5 for those. My typical bet size for sides, regular sides, are 1, 2, and 3. Occasionally, like in week 5, I had some 3.5-star plays. So I could have 4-star plays, but a lot of that has to do with familiarity. And if I have a marriage of situational power ranking, if the line's 2.5 points off from what my power ranking is, that's a power ranking play for me. It's especially valuable when it's on the dog side, over 35 years of historical data. It's especially valuable for me when there are coaches that are in their job longer than 3 seconds. I mean, it's what have you done for me lately? But when you get a coach like Mike Tomlin and Jim Harbaugh and some of these other guys, you can establish some tendencies. They're not going to change their stripes automatically. Or if it's Tomlin changing his stripes, he actually tells you, because he's blunt when he says, we're going to play more man-to-man, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. So you listen to what he has to say. And then the matchup analysis. So that'll, my typical play would be 1.5 to 2 stars on a straight play. Some things that are qualify only in one area would be a 1 star. And then when there's a marriage of things, then they could go to 3 stars or a little bit more. Season futures, for example, over-unders. I could be off the charts if I really like something, especially in under. I could be, what would be the equivalent of a 5 or whatever star if you're in college and it was the Nevada team last year with, that's off the charts or whatever. But, I have all kinds of variants that I don't really rely on the star system, because you have a limited sample. You have 12 games in college. You have 17 games in the NFL. There are certain fixed numbers. Kansas City's not going to win just 5 games. Carolina's not going to win 13 games. So you have fixed numbers to work with. And there's a lot of wiggle room. And actually, their books aren't cloning each other necessarily for season wins like they do with props and everything else. So I'm very much more of a range for that. And for props itself, there's never really going to be more than 1.5 star for a variety of reasons. Number one, I've gotten limited so many times already that there's not a use for me doing that. And in some cases, I might want a 1.5 star, but they're allowing me to play $12.50 on a particular prop. So I'm a whole company allows me $12.50. Well, if I like it, I'll put it on there. But most of my props are going to be a 1/2 star or 1 star anyway, because they're volatile. Let's put it that way. But if I have a lot of props, so it could add up if you have a big week. But that's pretty much what I'm going to do. Because the standard is 1, 2, 3, which is 1%, 2%, 3%.
Got it. And it sounds like 2 of my top takeaways. One, with things like props in particular, being mindful of account preservation. So that can be a big role in how you want to go about staking for certain prop bets that you're making. And then when it comes to a lot of other bet types, looking to find that balance that can be such an art as well as a science of maximizing your edge and also looking to smooth out the variance with an inherently small sample size.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think sometimes I spend too much time deciding how to go about player props. And then when I'm doing it, it says, well, wait a second, why am I not considering XYZ side? Because I've got all these unders on this particular situation. So it kind of balances it out that I'm thinking as I'm writing down these numbers that I'm going to be used. So it's actually a form of helping me with game evaluation too.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I think there's a lot of good food for thought behind that answer. And Ron, before we wrap up, we will weave in 2 pillars of the show that regular listeners will be well familiar with. First up, let's lead off with the Marmalefsky Minute. And about this time of the year, I think of something that Dave would often write about on his Point Blank column. And he would say the waiting is the hardest part, as a nod to Tom Petty. He'd cue up Tom Petty in the jukebox. And I know Tom Petty's had a birthday since our last show. So this quote is really top of mind for me. For Dave, of course, it wasn't waiting in the same way that Petty spoke to it, but waiting, WEIGHTING. How do we weight results with such a small sample size, knowing that we want to get more data, but we also need to adapt quickly? So to that end, Ron, when it comes to watching games and analyzing results, how do you go about deciding what to give pretty significant weight to and what to attach less weight to than some others might?
Thanks for the Tom Petty reference. Great band. Love his music. So that's
one of
great.
The best.
I'm looking for edges. It's easier to box score analysis is very important to me. I think you even brought this up with Seattle, for example. Fair and square win, -3 turnovers, and they won. So my argument would be, yeah, Seattle won by 10. They didn't win by 7 because they kicked a field goal, and Arizona people were probably upset that they lost. But in reality, Seattle was the better side and was clearly the better side. Atlanta, what did they do? Fumble at the 11, and then fumble in the end zone. They lost somewhere between 13 and 21 points. They needed a late field goal to win it, but clearly in that game, in my opinion, Atlanta was the better side. It's just one of those things. You could look at refereeing. Sometimes I hate to bring up refereeing, but obviously Cleveland, Indy could have gone in a different direction, for example. So I'm looking at that kind of stuff. If you're looking at pure line of scrimmage data, which is very important to me, like we mentioned before, the sacks and everything else, running backs that can't catch the ball or aren't scary catching the ball, I don't really care much about running backs. The example I give, with apologies to Ezekiel Elliott, not young Ezekiel Elliott, but old, every time the ball was thrown to Ezekiel Elliott, if I'm a defensive coordinator, I'm going like this. Because the most he's ever going to gain is 3 or 4 yards. I mean, you're basically throwing behind the chains. You're doing nothing. So there are a lot of running backs that do not move the needle to me. I may be looking at how a team establishes the line of scrimmage, but I'm even White in this game. I don't know what his number is right now. He doesn't move the needle for me because he doesn't do enough with his running and pass catching. He still has just 39 yards. So before we went on the air, we were talking about, oh, I'm going to lose that one because he had 34 yards and that's my big play, 50, whatever it was, 52 and a half yards. He's still sitting on 39, so maybe I have a chance.
Yeah, it's a 2-touchdown lead for Buffalo early fourth quarter. So unless Tampa Bay can make a comeback, it might be tough for them to justify giving him too much more work moving forward. And Ron, as we look to round a final corner, we can also weave in the hops, of course. And for starters, to bring things full circle, how are you enjoying your first foray into the beer that you had selected for this evening's conversation?
Still good. No aftertaste. Pretty smooth. I don't know how to categorize it. I don't have, like, when you were talking about your beer, you did a great job of defining it. I'm not good at defining things. I'm good at saying I like it or I don't like it. This is kind of a light tasting. There's no aftertaste. There's no wow, that it doesn't seem like one that would have a big head or top, like they would pour a Guinness or pour some of those others. That might be my favorite, but this one's very smooth. I could see me drinking more than one of these because it's easy to come down. There's not a dislike in it. I'm liking it.
That's the most important thing. I mean, I can nerd out on the craft beer process just like I can on the betting process, but at the end of the day, if you like it and it's hitting the spot, that's really what it comes down to. So glad you're liking this one. And then as my go-to source for dark beer recommendations, Ron, I've got to ask you if there are any other dark beer recommendations that you could share this week for the Props and Hops audience.
I didn't write them down. My wife writes them down and she puts them in a book or whatever. I should have had that book out here. So I'll have to put that. She writes down. What's the website that does that?
Untapped is a really popular app where you can check in a beer and give it a score and take some notes. So yeah, you were maybe onto Untapped before social media and smartphones were a thing.
No, not that. Only the last year and a half or whatever. Untapped thinks my wife is a very heavy drinker because she punches it all in under her name. and then she basically drinks, half a beer or something like that. So she gets a bad rep that way. But yeah, I rate them all. And then if I see something, we can pick up our phone and we go back. But unfortunately, I don't have it. I'm negligent. I didn't have it in front of this show, but I'm always up for trying new dark beers wherever we go.
I'll see if I can pick up the slack then for us here. I've got a couple that I'll throw out quickly, and let me know if you have experience with either of these. I think there's maybe a better chance that the first one would be up your alley, and that would be for those of us on the West Coast, and it's finally starting to feel like fall. There's a beer that I love called Shadow of a Doubt, and it's an Imperial Porter by Russian River Brewing Company out of Santa Rosa, California. 9.9% ABV. So Ron, probably a good bit heavier than the stout that you're working on tonight, but it's named after the classic Hitchcock movie filmed in Santa Rosa in 1943. And what I love is that, it's a big beer, but it's got some really nice chocolatey flavor, some smoked malt, and that soft body, a nice dry finish. So some similarity for sure to the porter that you're working on. Do you have any familiarity with that beer, or would you have any interest if you saw something with that description next time you make a beer run?
I'm going to try it. I believe I have had beers from that company though.
Yeah, a
So
Russian River is a powerhouse, mostly on the
yeah.
hoppy side of things, but Shadow of a Doubt as a porter is a really good one. And they've also become famous over the years for some of their Belgian-inspired sour beers. So I guess across the spectrum, they just cover all their bases. But Shadow of a Doubt, probably the best dark beer that I've had from them.
I will report back to you on it. I will seek it out.
All right. And then one more that for those listening who are not in the Russian River distribution footprint, no need to worry. This one is coming soon. I'm almost positive it's nationwide every year. It's another dark beer. Ron, it's also a hoppy one, Celebration Ale by Sierra Nevada. This is a fresh hop IPA. So even though it's an IPA, it's amber in color, and it's definitely an interesting mix of hoppy and dark, kind of our worlds combined. But this beer is just an annual rite of passage. And I think it's going to be widely available as the holiday season gets closer and closer. And for now, I'll just leave it at that and say it's a prohibitive favorite to be highlighted once again on this show as we get deeper into that holiday season.
I haven't had as much success with IPA, so I'm interested. IPA darks, is that a new thing, or is that what's going on with that?
It's probably something that was much more prominent years ago, and Sierra Nevada is just so strong at more classic styles or traditional styles. This one, it's more like an amber meets an IPA. So if you ever have any amber beers that you like as a style, a red ale or an amber, just with a bit more of a hot presence, but still a strong malt backbone to keep it balanced, I would say that that's what makes Celebration Ale quite widely appealing to a lot of people. Plus, just is a seasonal release with really iconic packaging from a very well-established brewery. It's also not just the beer itself, but a sign of, okay, it's a festive time of year. And if Sierra Nevada is producing Celebration Ale, then it usually means good times are in store for most of us.
Sounds good to me.
All right. Well, I'll have to make sure that sooner rather than later, you can report to me on your thoughts on both Shadow of a Doubt and Celebration Ale. And in addition to that, ask for you. I'll throw out a quick ask for the audience here. For those of you still with us, clearly a good sign that you're liking this show. If you're with us on YouTube, if you could please like this video, that would be greatly appreciated. On Twitter, liking this post would also be appreciated. And for those of you with us in podcast form, if you could take 5 seconds to leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that would be great as well. Last but not least, however you're listening, if you could support the show by supporting Right Angle Sports. If that's of interest to you, the custom link I've got is tinyurl.com/raspicks. And on YouTube and in podcast form, that link is in the show notes. On Twitter, that link is in the bio. Ron, I think we've covered a lot of ground. We're north of an hour now, so I want to let people know, last but not least, they can follow your work, and a good starting point via your bio and pin post would be, again, on the platform formerly known as Twitter. I can't get used to saying X yet, but people know what we mean, at Ron A Sports. Ron, I want to thank you for your time and insight tonight, and just have to call out as we wrap this up, we made it through without harping on the Chargers special teams, so I think a big underdog just cashed in this conversation.
Oh, they're doing much better. You know, they rapidly improved last year. That's not causing any problems for them right now. Maybe they've righted the ship there. I haven't had to talk about their special teams at all this year.
Yeah, maybe a bit of robbing Peter to pay Paul with some holes elsewhere in the roster, but we will leave that for another conversation. And right now, we will get ready to sign off as the Bills look to put away Tampa Bay. For those of you watching and listening, thank you for your time this evening. Enjoy the rest of Thursday Night Football, as well as the Week 8 slate all weekend in the NFL, and best of luck with your bets this weekend.